The SQL data source control builds two-tier applications. That is, pages communicate directly with the data source. You have the presentation tier and the data tier, and that's it. If you want to change the schema or change the data source, you're in for some trouble. This requires altering every page, and it's certainly difficult to maintain in a real application. The object data source binds to data that's retrieved by an intermediate object, that is, a middle tier. And that object communicates with the data source and provides data services for you. The object generally provides select, insert, update, and delete methods if all of those are required. You need to at least supply a select method so you have a way to get data. So how do you work with the object data source? Well, you have to create a data class, and your data class must meet these requirements. The class must be stateless. You really don't know when the data source will interact with your class and whether it will destroy the instance or not, so you really can't count on state being maintained by the class. It has to have a default parameterless constructor. That is, just a standard default constructor. The data manipulation methods must be instance methods, but I got to tell you, that's what the documentation says, but in my experience it worked fine if the methods were static or in VB shared. It didn't really seem to matter, but you might do some testing. The documentation says they must be instance methods. And the class must provide at least a single method that returns one or more rows of data. If your goal is to work with data, you need some way to get that data, so you have to at least have a method that returns one or more rows of data. Our sample project already includes an example of this sort of class. Let's look at the demonstration to see how you could use it in a web page. In our sample project, in the app_code folder, I've already set up two classes that do the work. For example, customer.cs is a very simple class that just gets and retrieves data from two private fields. Not very exciting stuff. In customerdb.cs, we have code that provides our data services. So let's look at this. We have a getCustomers method which returns a data table, and a saveCustomer method which takes in a customer to be saved back to the database. Both of these do their work with using brute force ADO.NET code. First of all, this procedure takes a connection, gets the connection string from the Northwind sample database from our web.config file, creates a connection, creates a data adapter, fills the data table, sets the table name, and returns the data table back. So we have a way to retrieve all the customers. In addition, we have a procedure which saves a customer. And this one does its work by creating a SQL data adapter with a parameterized command text. We'll need to specify that command text. Now notice we've got a select statement here, not an update statement. To create the update statement, I was kind of lazy, and I used the SQL command builder class. You give it a data adapter with a select statement, and it can then generate update, insert, and delete statements for you. Well, in our select command, we need to satisfy the @customerID parameter, and we do that by using the parameters.addWithValue method, given the parameter name and its value. So now we know which customer ID we're working with. We can get the update command by calling the getUpdate command method of the SQL command builder. Now that we have the update command, we can now call the update method. So all we need to do is fill the data table, set the company name equal to the new company name, and call the update method. That's it. There are many other ways we could have done this, but this is one simple way to perform an update. Down here we have a procedure you might have seen in a previous section of the course. This is the getConnectionString method, which retrieves a connection string by name from the web.config file. Well, that's all we need. Let's go to our form, here the web page that sets this up, and we have an object data source already on the page that I got from the Data tab here of my Toolbox window. I've already configured this thing. Let's go look at the configuration. We're getting our business object from CustomerDB. It knows there are only two classes I could use, and that's the one I want to use. Within that class, we need to find the correct procedures for select, update, insert if we use it, and delete if we use it. For select, there's only one procedure that satisfies the needs. That is the get customers, which returns data table. Whatever you select here has to return either a data set, a data reader, a strongly typed collection, or a single row of data. So that's the only one we have. For the update, in this case, you need to have a procedure which accepts a parameter for each property you want to update. That would be individual properties, or a single parameter which is the entire object you want to update. You even see examples here. There is one that accepts an entire product or one that accepts individual properties. Ours accepts an entire customer, so we could use that procedure, and there are no others that satisfy these needs. For insert, you have the same needs, and we could use that procedure if it performed an insert, and it doesn't. For delete, we have slightly different needs. This one either needs to accept an entire row to be deleted or the primary key of a row. We could use save customer because it satisfies the needs if it did the work, but it doesn't, so I'll leave that blank. So we have no way to perform an insertion or deletion in the current scenario. We do have a way to select or update, and for now I'll click cancel because I've already configured my web page. Here I have a grid view control that's set up to use Object Data Source 1 as its data source, and it has enabled paging and editing. Not selection, because I have no reason to do that at this point. And let's give it a try. I'll view the page in the browser. And notice that we have filled in this grid view control with information from that database. And there's no information in this page anywhere about the schema or the data coming from the Northwind database. It has no idea where the data came from. As far as it knows, it came from some class somewhere that provided the data. We can edit a row. If I change this and update and refresh the page, I'll just do it by closing and reopening the page, you'll see that my data changes stuck. There's that extra S. I'll edit again to put it back where it was. But in any case, we've proved the point. We have used the Object Data Source control and methods of this class to perform all the data operations we need, and we've done that without putting any information about the data in this page. Should the schema of the database change, you can modify this class, but you wouldn't have to touch anything on this page. Like the Object Data Source control, the Link Data Source control allows you to bind data stored in some data source to a page without the page having to know anything about that data. You bind the results of a link query. That can be a database or an in-memory set of data. You can perform that binding at design time or at runtime by setting the context type name property of the link data source. The easiest way to do this is to use the Link to SQL class designer to create design time binding to SQL Server data. Now, it makes sense to use this control rather than the SQL data source because all connection and command information is in the generated class as opposed to in each page. And you can bind to any link query result, although, as I mentioned, the easiest way to do this is to use Link to SQL classes so you have a visual designer and you can lay out the design at design time. Let's try working with the Link Data Source control and see how easy it is to extract the data information from the web page. Let's start by creating the data context class. To do that, I need to create a Link to SQL class, so I'll right-click, choose Add New Item, choose Link to SQL Classes, and I'll name this Northwind because I am, again, using the Northwind sample database. Of course, it asks if I want to place it into the app_code folder. I'll say yes. If you don't see the Server Explorer tab here or somewhere, you can choose View Server Explorer to display it. But for now, I do see it, so I'll just open it up there. I'm not going to use a stored procedure, so I can drag this a little farther over. If you don't have a data connection already set up for Northwind, and of course you must because you're working in this project, but in case in general you don't, you right-click, choose Add Connection, and create the connection here. You've seen how to do that already. I'm going to keep this really simple. I just want to work with products. So I'll take the products table, drag it onto the design surface. The designer creates a class named product and hooks up all the data binding for me. I close this up and save it, and we're all done. I'd like to create a new page now. So to do that, I'll right-click, choose Add New Item. I'll choose Web Form and name it Link Data Source Demo. Now I'm sort of used to my style sheet, so I'll drag it on to attach the style so it looks a little nicer. And now let's add a link data source control. We go down to the Data tab and find the link data source. There it is. Let's configure the data source. Here we want to choose a data context object, and we only have the one, Northwind data context. I click Next. And now here I could choose from available classes within that data context class. I only have one, products. I could choose to group by one of the fields, but I have no need to do that. And I'll choose the fields I need, which include product ID, product name, unit price, units in stock. Let's add a where clause. This should look very familiar since it's the same page you saw when working with the SQL data source control. This time, I'm going to filter the data based on what I pass in the query string. So I'll filter based on category ID equals a value coming from the query string. The query string field, I'll make up a name, category ID. I'll give it a default value, so if you don't bother passing anything in on the query string, you'll still get valid page results. I'll add that. And you'll see that we now have a new expression, a where clause, and the value is satisfied by getting it from request.queryString, looking for the field named category ID in the query string. Click OK. Let's add an order by, and here we can order by something as before, just like in the SQL data source. I'll choose product name, and that should do it for now. And click Finish. And we've now configured our link data source. I need to add a grid view control to bind this to, just to demonstrate another control you haven't seen yet. So I'll drag the grid view on and place it on the page. I can't bypass the auto format, so let's pick some auto formatting. There we go. Let's choose the link data source that we just created. Notice that when we do that, I'll put this away for now, the grid has readjusted itself to include the schema from that linked data source. If I view the Smart tag here again, we should be able to do some other formatting. Notice that you don't see an option, however, to edit the data. Well, why not? The problem is we have to go modify the linked data source. If we go modify the properties here, let's find the properties of the linked data source control. There we go. In the select property, there's information here that doesn't allow this control to perform edits. So we have to just delete this and allow the data source to figure out what it wants to do. So I'll delete that property and now go back up to our data source, and you'll see we can enable each of these things. Once I've enabled them on the data source, I should be able to come to the grid view control, and now they're available here. So I can enable paging, sorting, editing, deleting, and selection within the grid view control. At this point, all the columns within the grid are read-only. To make them not be read-only, I need to edit the columns. And for each one of these that I want to be read-write, like product name, I need to find the read-only property and set it to false. There we are. So now we're ready to go. Let's save everything and test the page. Let's view in the browser. Well, it looks like paging works just fine. That's good. How about sorting? Yep, that works great. I can click once to sort one way, click again to sort another way. Can I edit a row? Click Update. Oops, guess I missed a step. It's easy to figure out what's wrong. It can't find a primary key value, so it can update the row. And this is a little bit obscure, and I meant to do this, really I did. If we look at the properties of the grid view control, there's a data key names property, which has to provide a mapping between the primary keys of the grid and the data source, and this should be filled in. I'm not sure why it's not. But if you find that it's not, you just put in here the name of the primary key within your data source. In that case, now, if I save it all and run it again, we should be in great shape. I get to that same item, click Edit, make a change, click Update, and it all works fine. So you can see that we've done the work of binding a grid view control to the data within the Northwind sample database without having to embed any information here about the schema, except where we had to set the primary key field on this control. But should the schema change, it should be easy to perform the updates just by regenerating this link to SQL classes. Using the link data source makes it easy for you to create middle-tier business objects that can be stored in some other assembly if you want, and then bind to them on your web pages. Imagine you were given an XML file and you wanted to display its contents on a web page. You could parse out the data manually, but there's an easier way. The XML data source control allows you to extract XML data from a file and display it in any formatted way you like. You display data on a page using bound controls that are bound to this XML data source control. You need to supply 2 or possibly 3 values. You need to supply the name of the XML file, an XPath expression indicating the items you want to retrieve from the XML file, and optionally, an XSL template that transforms the data before you perform the binding. In our demonstration, we'll retrieve data from an XML file and use XPath to indicate the items we want to retrieve. Now note that this data access is read-only. You can't perform changes in an XML file using this control. In addition, we'll introduce a new control you haven't yet worked with, the form view control. For this demonstration, I've already created a new sample page named XML DataSource Demo, and I'd like to drag the style sheet over because I'm used to the way that looks. Now, from the Toolbox window, we can go to the Data tab and drag over an XML data source control. There's not much to this one. We'll configure the data source, and we can choose a data file that contains our XML. It's in our app_data folder, and there it is, bookstore.xml. We also need a way to, well, we don't want to transform it, but we do need an XPath expression, which indicates what we want to look for. I'll show you the XML file in a moment, but for now, I just know that I want bookstore/genre/book. That'll get me at the book elements I want to retrieve data from. Remember that, bookstore/genre/book. If we go look at the data, you'll see that our bookstore has a root element named bookstore. That's why I started my expression with bookstore. Beneath that, I have an element named genre, which I could have multiples. And within there, I'm looking for elements named book. Therefore, my XPath was bookstore/genre, which looks one level below it for an element named genre, and then /book, which looks one level below that for an element named book. So I'll get all of this information retrieved for my data source. We have an ISBN attribute, a title attribute, and a price attribute for each book. Here now, I need to add the form view control and lay out the data. So I'm trying to use as many different data-bound controls as I can. So let's drag this one on. And the form view control is much like the details view. It shows you data from one row of some data source, but it does it in a free-form layout. You can put stuff wherever you want it. It's not all rigid like the details view control. So here, auto format, well, doesn't really do too much, because it's just a block of data. I'm not sure what the point of that was. And now we can choose our data source, XML data source 1, and there's our data, all ready to go. Now we should be able to also enable paging, which allows us to move through the rows of data. Like many other controls, the form view control supports the idea of templates. Now we have avoided talking about it for any other control so far. We'll look at templates in terms of the grid view control in a separate section. But I can choose Edit Templates here, and that gives me the option to modify the layout of this form view control. Once I'm in template editing mode, I can move things around wherever I want. Kind of cool how they place the data they found in the XML data source control by default for us here within this form view control. Notice that there are a number of different templates we could be editing. There's the item template, that's where the data actually gets displayed. There's the footer template, that's the footer for this control. There's the edit item template, which is meaningless in this condition because we can't edit the XML data, so there's no point even looking at that. Same for insert item. There's a header template for the header for the control. There's the empty data template, which is what displays if there's no data. An empty template seems good. And the pager template, which controls what the pager area looks like. Well, I want to work with the item template in this case, and let's lay it out a little differently. I'm going to delete everything that's already here. There we go. And I'm going to insert a table. I'll choose Table, Insert Table, and this allows me to choose how large I want the table. I want 2 columns and 3 rows. That'll be fine for now. I'll click OK, and there's our table. Let's select the table, and let's modify it a little. I'm going to set the width to make sure it's set to 100%. There we go. It looks like it was anyway by default. And let's go modify the rows. Here, I need to modify the layout of this row. Go to Table, Modify. Well, I guess I need to select both cells before I can merge them. So let's select both cells. There we go. Table, Modify, Merge Cells. There we go. I just want the one cell on the top row. Let's set the width of this cell to be 25 pixels. There we go. So we've set the width of the first column. Let's set the width of this one to be 100%, just to make sure it's set correctly. There we go. All right, so now we'll put stuff into those various cells. I need to type into the first cell. Let's go back here, and let's just type ISBN : and in here, let's put in price. There we go. And now let's drag a label control here. We drag a label control rather than typing because I want to display the name of the book here. So I'll drag a label over. There we are. And let's edit the data bindings for this label. I need the text property to be bound to the title property from our data source. We could specify a format here if we wanted. We have no reason to do that. Okay, that's all we have to do for this one. There's no point turning on two-way data binding. That would allow us to save changes back because this is read-only data, so that's not going to happen. Okay, let's finish this up by adding labels here and edit its data binding. That's ISBN. And here, price. Edit its data binding and bind to the price field. I guess we're done for now, so let's end template editing here by choosing it from the Smart tag. Okay, looks like we're ready to go. Let's view the page in the browser. I'll save it first. And we should now see the title in that top row, the ISBN number, the price. And as we move from one to the other, the data updates as well. So we've shown here how to use the XML data source control to get the data from an XML file and how to use the form view control to lay out data in a free-form sort of way bound to some data source. Of course, this control doesn't have to be bound to an XML data source. You could use the form view control with any of the data source controls. I just chose it for this particular example to show off the XML data source.